Good evening. My name is Glenn Olivier Parker, and I am Head of Learning and Research Services here in Ingram Library. It is my delight to welcome each of you, both our in-person audience and the people who are joining us via live stream, plus our large audience who joins us later watching this as a video we will post online. And I'm just really thrilled that you are joining us here this evening. Thank you for being here. This event tonight is the 2024 Ingo Swann Research Fellowship Lecture. The Ingo Swann Research Fellowship was established in honor of Ingo Swann, an artist, author, and explorer of human capabilities and consciousness. In an incredible act of generosity, his family established this fellowship to advance scholarship in the field of parapsychology and to encourage use of the parapsychology collections held here in Ingram Library to be used in creative and unique ways. This fellowship provides crucial support to individuals in their research pursuits, giving them precious time to dive into the remarkable archival and rare book collections which explore human consciousness held here in Ingram Library. This first-hand encounter with rare primary source materials is intended to be transformative, to slip them into the liminal space and suspended time of archival research that bridges the past and the present, the past and the living. And to give time and space for the fellow to ponder, interrogate, integrate, and apply their discoveries to their chosen academic discipline, profession, or field of practice. I'd like to offer profound thanks to Ellie Flippen, the niece of Ingo Swann, who's here seated in the front row, whose family endowed the Ingo Swann Research Fellowship. The University of West Georgia and our community benefits from Ellie's and the Swann Writer Productions, LLC, passionate and committed support. And we deeply thank you. Selection of the fellow is done by committee. And I would like to give hearty thanks to the thoughtful contributions of Dr. Christine Simmons-Moore, Professor of Psychology, Dr. Nathan Loris, Associate Professor in Anthropology and Director of the Antonio J. Waring Archaeological Laboratory, who is also the newly named Co-Director of Undergraduate Research, and Dr. Julie Talbot, Associate Professor of Physics. These committee members, along with me, reviewed applications and selected this year's fellow. I'd also like to thank the UWG Foundation and the Executive Director of Development, Haley Jackson, and the graduate students and staff in the Ingram Library, especially Cole Neer, Stephanie Gordon, Catherine Hendricks, Melissa Farley, and Jean Cook, along with Tech Services, Jackson Witzel. The logistics of this evening are that we have an audience joining us via live stream. Online attendees, please feel welcome to add your questions by selecting the Q&A button in Zoom. And Jean Cook will be the moderator and will be relaying your questions at the end of the lecture. This evening's lecture, Remote Viewing for Narrative Healing in a Missing Persons Cold Case, will be given by our honored guest and 2024 Ingo Swann Research Fellow, Suzanne Clores. Suzanne Clores is an author and podcast creator who writes about our relationship with the otherworldly. Her first book, Memoirs of a Spiritual Outsider, eventually led her to create and produce her podcast, The Extraordinary Project, a narrative series that explores our cultural curiosity about psi. She wrote about Eileen J. Garrett's Parapsychology Foundation for the New York Times. And her work has aired on National Public Radio, otherwise known as NPR, and her work has also appeared in Hearst magazines, the Huffington Post, as well as literary publications. Her personal essays have been anthologized and used in college classrooms. We love to hear that here at the university. And she teaches creative writing at Lake Forest College in Illinois. She has received grants from the Illinois Arts Center the Illinois Arts Council and the Emerald Gate Foundation, and has had residencies at the Malay Center for the Arts, the Vermont Studio Center, the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, and the Ragdale Foundation. She received her BA from Columbia University and her MFA in fiction from the University of Arizona. When not writing or exploring, she takes very cold open water swims in Lake Michigan. What a hearty soul you must be. Plays with her tireless English pointer and travels as much as possible with her family. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne.
I could just listen to Blynn speak forever. She has such a beautiful voice. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you, Blynn Oliveri Parker and the Ingo Swann Research Fellowship for choosing me this year. It's an incredible honor to be here. I have really appreciated your expertise, Blynn, and our conversations since. Let me move this a little closer. Since coming here, this collection is magnificent. Thank you also to Cole Neer for supporting my research process and locating resources quickly and efficiently. So this week has been an unparalleled education on the life and the work of Ingo Swann. What I found among the mountains of material about this wildly talented figure who, among other accomplishments, created the remote viewing method, is that remote viewing as a tool has had another equally powerful use besides its primary one. And that is the power to create a new narrative, to uncover invisible information and provide a new frame around the stories that we tell ourselves. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a missing persons cold case and how a family's choice to use a remote viewer led them towards extraordinary healing from loss. So, as you've already heard, I'm a writer and a podcast creator, and for the last decade, I've been interested in extraordinary phenomena. Extraordinary is my word for psi, the paranormal, the anomalous, the non-local, and all related verbiage having to do with the invisible and unseen forces in our human experience. My creative mission is to explore the ways the extraordinary affects and enhances our lives. And I try to do this through story. I want to take a minute to define my terms. When I say extraordinary phenomena, I'm thinking about the big four: precognition, clairvoyance, telepathy, and psychokinesis. Precognition is detecting the future from the present. Clairvoyance is knowing information in the present without using the five senses. Telepathy is communicating mind to mind, and psychokinesis is influencing physical matter without any known physical force that we recognize. And there's plenty of science on all of these phenomena, and scientists in the field of parapsychology say these four aspects of psi occur spontaneously in most people's lives at some point, and have since antiquity. More rarely, highly sensitive individuals work with these phenomena for greater wisdom, wellness, communication, or life-changing discovery. Occasionally, these individuals have a chance to affect the wider culture. I became interested in these extraordinary individuals, whether famous or obscure, and found that the best way to understand their abilities is to catch them in action. And so while I was on the lookout for situations where the extraordinary might be useful, I came across two sisters, Catherine and Dawn Mosino. Their names fluttered across my desk attached to an FBI flyer and a request for help. When I read the missing persons report and saw Dawn Mosino's face, my heart fell. She had vanished without a trace back in 1989, and her sister Kath had been looking for answers ever since. I wondered if an extraordinary approach to her disappearance could help. The details are 24-year-old Dawn Mosino went missing in May of 1989 when she was walking home from work in the small Pennsylvania town of Radnor outside of Bryn Mawr. For the next 3 decades, Dawn would be the symbol of a stalled investigation, an overwhelmed law enforcement department, an inconclusive FBI search, an incarcerated person of interest who refused to admit culpability. And most of all, her disappearance became a gaping hole of loss and distress for family and community. In June of 2023, no one knew what had happened to Dawn still or where her body could be found, and it had been 34 years. Catherine Mosino, Dawn's younger sister, had taken matters into her own hands 8 years ago, and now she wanted an investigative podcast to help restart the search. When we first spoke on the phone, I heard enormous strength and magnetic grief in her voice, and out of empathy and compassion, I almost felt myself falling into the gaping hole of loss too. This first clip of audio is of Kath speaking to me about Dawn and what kind of person she was, and the loss that she's carried since she disappeared.
When Dawn was born, and she had a few minutes where she didn't breathe right away. Her learning disability, wasn't diagnosed as like a Down syndrome or on the autism spectrum. When I was growing up, Dawn was labeled as slow. Loved to smile, loved to be active, loved to be social. She learned how to take public transportation. She learned responsibility of being at work on time and how to get there and what to wear and how to present herself. Those were all extra steps, life skills that she had to learn. She loved to be around people, which was the reason why that job at Bryn Mawr Hospital was perfect for her. She was delivering food trays to patients in the hospital. She could go in and be happy and talk to them, and it's just like her way. I had been doing this for 8 years. I reread her diary, and now I have all these other theories and questions, and started uncovering all this other information, and kind of got to the point where I was like, what were the other possibilities that we didn't really explore properly all those years ago? And was the investigation really done the way it should have been done all those years ago? People tell me all the time, you're too much, you're pushy, but when you're looking for answers that have to do with a human being, a life that's been lost, literally, you would expect some kind of transparency, openness. I don't get that anymore with the police. I did, but these were 1, 2, 3, 4 detectives ago. When you go through some great loss, you learn to carry it with you and how to live while you're carrying it. But it's not emotional for me. If anything, it's just frustrating.
So Kath's relationship with law enforcement had been worn out, and you can hear the defeat in her voice, but she was not defeated. Her main impasse was that she believed law enforcement stopped their search for Dawn too soon, and that they named the wrong perpetrator. She believed this for lots of reasons. The individual they named was Dawn's acquaintance, and he was already incarcerated, so he made sense as a suspect. But after 15 years, he still wouldn't plead guilty, despite a plea deal, offers of reward money, and a commuted sentence. Kath felt like the real perpetrator was still at large, and he knew where Dawn's body could be found. When I asked her if she would be open to using an extraordinary method called remote viewing to help advance the search, she said yes right away, and I got a flash of Dawn's face in my mind, like a gate had opened for the first time in a long time, like there was a chance to set her free. In the history of extraordinary research, remote viewing is a pretty new method. Designed in the 1970s by trusted psychic Ingo Swann, together with two government scientists, Dr. Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, remote viewing is a format, a scientifically validated system that uses psi to gather information across space and time. Here's Dawn. Much like a shaman's ability to astral travel, the skilled remote viewer can hypothetically go to a situation anywhere in the world and at any time in history and accurately glimpse images, sounds, smells, impulses, and physical sensations. They do this while remaining blind to the subject and while remaining in the here and now. You can imagine how valuable a skill this would be to a government. The remote viewing program, known best as Project Stargate, ran during the Cold War from 1972 to 1995 in the Clandestine Operations Division. At its best, remote viewing utilizes all four extraordinary capacities I mentioned: precognition, clairvoyance, telepathy, and PK all at once. Viewers are asked to mentally go to a target and report what they perceive. And at first, remote viewing was used operationally in tandem with other intelligence collection methods. The government would send a spy called an outbounder into the field, and the remote viewer would stay in a closed conference room with nothing but a pen and a piece of paper. While the outbounder navigated the target in the real world, the remote viewer would concentrate and try to draw pictures of what the outbounder was seeing and experiencing. One of the problems with that method is that the outbounder was still at risk. While they were lurking around at KGB headquarters or pursuing an underground bomb hideout, the outbounder was exposed to danger while the remote viewer was safe in a conference room. So they cut the outbounder from the protocol and concentrated on training the remote viewers to perceive more abstract targets. Ingo Swann, the psychic who co-designed remote viewing, was a painter who had his first out-of-body experience when he was 3 years old. Swann's natural psi capacity was vast, and while he claims to not have awakened to its full volume until midlife, his visionary art style is based, I think, on his ability to see beyond the ordinary world. In a 1975 letter that describes one of his paintings, Swann writes, "Man has bodies other than the physical. The body itself is surrounded by electronic vibrations that activate neural physical systems that are often displayed around the body as auras." Swann writes as if he knows firsthand, and unlike many psychics who use their talent to heal, Swann was driven to serve the government. In addition to countless experiments with out-of-body experience, psychokinesis, and telepathy, of which he counted at least 36 forms of energy, Swann remote viewed celestial objects like the moon, Mars, and Jupiter. Eventually, he was credited for discovering Jupiter's rings 6 years before NASA confirmed it. Since its inception, trained remote viewers have helped government and law enforcement agencies find hidden nuclear weapons, new technologies, terrorist plots, captured hostages, and hundreds of other vital investigative and operational tasks. Viewers have also helped law enforcement crack cold cases and find missing persons, which is exactly what I hoped to do with a viewer who I knew. It was my great luck that the remote viewer I knew, Elisa Lagana, worked on missing persons cold cases all over the world. Like Swann, she was a natural psychic and had a long history with psi sensitivity. Her remote viewing name is E, or EL, her initials, and I met her at a remote viewing conference in Las Vegas. She worked as a physician by day, and we had done a few targets since we first met, which I covered in the first season of The Extraordinary Project in an episode called Chasing EL. Because E, like Swann, had been exposed to anomalous energy since childhood, she took to the remote viewing method quickly. After almost 2 decades working as a viewer, I suspected she could help recover important information about Dawn's disappearance, about Dawn herself, and maybe even about Dawn's perpetrator. Of course, there was a risk in trying this. E could be wrong in her view. She could get caught in analytical overlay or front-loading. These are terms that viewers use for intellectual conflict, normal functions of the mind that cloud the accuracy of their view. But besides those accuracy risks, E could also discover too much information, family secrets that the Mozinos would rather keep private, or confidential FBI or law enforcement data. In remote viewing, everything comes through. But Kath didn't mind the risks. She had been rereading Dawn's diary for years and felt like she had hit a brick wall in terms of directions to go. Remote viewing promised her something, if not something concrete, then something new. When I emailed E to see if she was interested, she called to say she would do it, and that because of my call, she had already begun to receive information. This person is deceased, she said right away, and there's no nice way to say this, but they are in multiple pieces. About 40 minutes later, she emailed to say, the whole transcript is done. Remote viewing sessions are relatively quick, but analytical. They get recorded on a transcript. You interpret a transcript the way you do any text, keeping in mind the time, place, and the viewer's intentions. In E's case, she is the viewer, and her intention was to find Dawn, and the time was 34 years ago, and the place was Radnor, Pennsylvania. E tasked herself to go into the past and to look at the circumstances just before Dawn's disappearance in May of 1989. And I'm going to play the first segment of her viewing session.
This is E, and this is the first session in the missing persons case. I'm front-loaded with the name of the missing person, location last seen, photos from the missing persons cold case, agency case number. And I'm going to focus on her name, Dawn. Viewer will focus on the day that Dawn disappeared. Go to the events just prior to the disappearance. And the energy is showing me a road with trees predominantly on one side. And it feels like the foliage is heavier on this one side of the street. So the energy that I'm describing that's moving is the life form. It's Dawn. Immediately when I touch on the word Dawn, I just get this overwhelming feeling of happiness. She's happy, she's feeling joy, it's almost blissful. And so on this day, I just get a sense of just smiling all the time, just following her routine. And it seems like she was happy and excited about something, so there was a reason for her to feel happiness. And it feels like it was about an event, and it feels like a celebration. She's excited to have something sweet. When I go into her mind, there's this visual of a cake. So I wanted to go back to the events and what I saw happening and describe that in more detail. Dawn is walking down this path to her destination. And all of this feels very familiar. It feels like a routine, feels like something she did all the time, felt very safe, and she feels very happy. And what happens is this male, he has short, dark hair, almost black, it's straight, and a very square, boxy face, and just that squareness to the jawline. And his age range would be about 22, 23, but heavier on the 22. He's wearing a dark black t-shirt with some jeans. I started to get a name. He approaches her, he's known to her, and he's talked to her before. And in his way, he liked her. And I think it's really important to understand that it was in his way. And this wasn't planned by her. She doesn't know that he wants to meet her. This wasn't an agreement for them. And this almost feels like a spontaneous impulse for him, a lack of impulse control to go to her. She's such a pretty thing. And other sides saying that too. So he sees her as an object. And I have really strong confirmation of that. And I don't really think that he has the same kind of emotional stability. He doesn't have the same understanding as you would see in a neurotypical individual. And I see him trying to talk to her, and she has a destination. So she's not interested in going with him. She doesn't want to, but he doesn't take no for an answer. What he does is he says, I have a present for you. And there's this sense of confusion, excitement, and fear. All three of those emotions kind of go through her, but she goes with him. She goes with him.
The whole transcript was 10 pages, and the audio version was about 25 minutes, with deep narrative detail like you just heard. He asked me to send Kath both written and audio transcripts, because sound has a greater vibration than words on a page. Kath and I went through the written transcript together over the phone, page by page. This particular remote view looks down on Dawn from above, and it's drawn mostly from an aerial view. When we got to the page in which the crime is described, I asked Kath if she wanted to skip it. She said she was fine. She had her guard up, maybe against the material, but maybe against believing in remote viewing too. That little piece of skepticism serves as protection. So to put it most succinctly, according to E, once this male brought Dawn into the car, she was raped, strangled, and suffocated. This happened quickly and impulsively, like he didn't mean to do it, but he did it. E took pains to explain that Dawn did not suffer a lot, and that the male filled with regret and confusion instantly, that it was an impulse control problem, according to E, and that he kept Dawn in the car for 3 days, dismembered her, and then placed her into the ground in 5 spots. In this transcript, there were so many vivid details, both physical and energetic, but 3 important ones I want to highlight. E did not identify the same person of interest who the police had suspected. The person of interest who police were pursuing was a Black man and was already incarcerated. E described the perpetrator as white, male, and still walking around in the area. Number 2, E drew a map of where Dawn's body was buried. And number 3, because E was a natural psychic, she was able to channel a message from Dawn saying that she was okay, but that she was waiting to go home. She was trapped in the trauma of the crime, stuck not so much in the place where she was buried, but also in the time, in the decades of unanswered questions, in the big gaping hole of the family's unresolved grief. The family needed to acknowledge her and break free of that energy of the crime. They needed to move on in order for Dawn to move on. So here, remote viewing does more than gather analytical facts. It facilitates a path to healing. I really felt for Kath as she tried to process. I expected her to disregard the transcript on some level. It was a lot to take in, and what proof did we have that any of this was accurate? Except that when Kath looked closer at the map where Dawn's body might be, she recognized the geography. From E's crude squiggles and descriptive audio, a wooded area in between 2 larger trees, not far from her house. I was astonished. E had conducted the view from her home in California, drawn a map of suburban Pennsylvania where she had never been, and was now being given feedback that the map was recognizable. Kath wasn't about to go running to her small town police department with a remote viewer's transcript, but she believed the police never searched this little section. She wanted to walk to the location, and she asked me if I would be willing to walk to the spot with her. Of course, I said yes, not because I wanted to look for Dawn's body, but because I knew what kind of support was necessary when it came to the extraordinary. By walking the park with Kath, I could help make it real, sort of meet her in her grief and walk her through it. And here I want to emphasize the narrative healing aspect of remote viewing. While government viewers focus on targets and data points, remote viewing has an expanded application for missing persons. Viewers can create a bridge leading out of the past and towards the future. It gives a grieving sister like Kath a fresh way of thinking, a new frame on reality and hope for the future. As it turned out, a series of snafus got in the way of me walking the park in person. But Kath and I agreed to FaceTime together with E, and on a very hot July day, Kath led us towards the area she had in mind based on E's map. And here's a clip from our Zoom call.
When I look at your transcript and saw those X's, this is the area that came to my mind. This little section right up in here.
Ooh, right there, go back to the left, sorry, stop, go straight towards that tree. To the other one, go to the right, more,
To the right.
oh, my right, yeah, that one,
Go towards this tree.
yes.
I mean, this is what I envisioned when you sent me this transcript. And I mean, it's,
I have really strong confirmation of yes with that area and that particular tree, you need to start there. It's really heavy energy on me with that. I don't know how detailed you want me to give you with regards to what I'm feeling, but I feel like she was placed in the ground in an area under that tree nearby. And I know you read the transcripts and you've heard from people that I picked up that she was in multiple pieces.
Right.
I feel like predominant strong energy right there.
Okay.
So like go start there, but actually move to the other side of that tree.
Yeah, behind it is a drop down into the creek. Although there is a path back here.
Okay.
And that leads you back, that here's the path that goes down.
Yeah, like the path I drew with the trees on the left-hand side. Okay.
All right, so this is where they were being pulled. So,
Yeah, extremely strong energy, like I'm getting chills and just a squeezing feeling that's where you need to go, that's where you need to start. Closure doesn't always come on our terms.
Cause it feels like she's kind of trapped, that energy is trapped there, and that you really need to go there and allow her to move on. And actually go to that one tree area and say it's okay.
Yeah,
And I know that's really hard to do.
To be honest, this was a very tense experience. There was the palpable feeling of now what? Kath was wishing she could dig. She could find some piece of clothing or an artifact. She wanted to do something. She wanted some catharsis, but it didn't happen. Instead, Kath said very quietly that this area was a place she had always imagined Dawn was. She would drive by 4 or 5 times a day for years. She had recurring dreams about it. E then recommended 3 things. That's us walking to the tree. She recommended that Kath begin to visit the spot more often and bring her family. That she get some kind of memento, something like a tiny bracelet that can be broken in half, maybe a heart with 2 pieces. One piece can be worn and the other piece left by the tree, so that whenever Kath touches the bracelet, she can think of Dawn in a new way, not in the context of crime, but in the context of her release. And then when she does think of Dawn, she recommended that Kath remember that she is okay and ready to move on, that she's separate from this crime, that she's been found and can be set free. I didn't know how much of this advice Kath would actually take and how much she really believed, but I kept in touch with her. The podcast came out and she wrote to say that the story was heard by many in her community, that she felt validated and felt hope for the first time in a long time. We kept in touch, but 6 months later when I called Kath to check in, an incredible thing had happened. I barely recognized her voice. It was no longer a low growl, but higher in register and lighter, like a great weight had been lifted. She told me her relationship with law enforcement had completely changed, from contentious to collaborative. Not only that, she brought the transcript to law enforcement and they admitted it into evidence. And while I can't confirm that they are acting on it right now, I've been in touch with a detective directly since then, and they have reignited their focus on the case. More importantly, Kath says she feels closer to Dawn, sees signs of her everywhere, hears songs that she loved on the radio, notices jewelry that she would like. Kath is headed in a new direction, closer to closure, regardless of what happens in the investigation. She is less defined by Dawn's disappearance and more by her release. Thank you.
Welcome questions from the audience, and we'll be checking questions also online.
Incredible.
Thank you. You have any questions about it? Not yet. It's like sinking in. Yes.
This is a bit of a morbid question, but did you find out during the course of this work whether police cadaver dogs would still be useful after that period of time?
Can you
Not,
repeat the question into the microphone?
yes,
Or-
yes. The question is, after, in this process, did we determine whether or not police cadaver dogs would still be useful after this period of, long period of time? We asked them to take a stroll with the dogs. They did not think it would be useful. They did use dogs in the beginning, right after the disappearance, but Kath is certain that this little section did not get searched for whatever reason.
is it in a public area or private property?
Yeah, good question. So it's in a big public park. And I go into this and the series, it's in a place that, like I said, Kath drives by many times a day and has always felt like, and understandably, she hasn't really wanted to entertain the idea that Dawn was there, but she has always felt like something was happening there. She likes the idea that there are kids playing nearby. There are beautiful trees and flowers nearby. She says it's a place that feels like Dawn is part of the community. And so that's why she feels like it's appropriate to put a piece of jewelry there and not really like disturb the land with curiosity that might yield nothing.
We have a question from online that asks from Julia Mossbridge. In your time so far with the archives, do you have a sense that Ingo acknowledged or spoke about the healing power of remote viewing?
So I went in looking for that, and I did not find too much evidence that he was interested in healing. He had many requests for healing. Lots of people compared him to Edgar Casey in terms of skill, psi ability, but you know, I did find a folder that was in the remote viewing box, one of the remote viewing boxes, and it had several pages of healing experiments that were not 100% clear to me exactly what was being done, but there was a description of a step-by-step process for healing. And so you have to wonder, was he working on something? Was he experimenting on himself? It was a surprise to me. I was actually looking for something like this. I wondered if he had any interest in the healing potential of remote viewing. And so this file, I'll have to study it more. Yeah.
So in one sense, it doesn't really matter if it's true, if the narrative brought about healing. But wouldn't you think the police would be curious to confirm that X's on a map and just start digging up, looking for something?
You would think
Like,
so.
It wouldn't take a lot of resources.
So there are a few tips. I didn't, I don't feel 100% comfortable going deep into it, but one of the tips is that the name that Elisa came up with was a name that the family recognized. And they hadn't thought about it in this particular way for a long time, the name of the possible perpetrator. And so that information did go to the police. I'm not privy to that information with what they're doing with it, but it's remarkable that she got a name that the family recognized. Law enforcement is a whole other process, and I know that there are some remote viewers who do successfully work with law enforcement. So we're hoping that they'll come around.
Did you ever actually make it to the Pennsylvania town, or are you planning on going at some point?
At some point I might. These things take a long time. Yes.
How many remote viewers do you think or part of the process? Like, how many are there?
In the world working?
Yes, sure.
Oh, I mean, maybe thousands. Right? I think Ellie could speak to that, or are there any remote viewers in the audience?
They may not be called that. They
Right.
may call themselves that, and they just ask for body or OBE. Might not be the same thing, but it is the same thing. It's still energy, right? At the end of the day, it's like energy healing and energy viewing. You're using your energy to see somewhere that you're not. Seems to me that it's very similar to out of body experience, or like I said, astral projection, a similar approach, or just use in different ways.
There are definitely a lot of energy workers, people who have different psi capacities. I did find in the archives this week a very specific 5-part ingredients to becoming a remote viewer. And it's almost like you're not a remote viewer unless you have, or you're not doing a remote viewing experiment unless you have these 5 pieces. And those, would you like to hear what those are?
Yeah.
Okay, so you need a subject or a viewer. You need a target. You need to have some psi capacity. You need to have, meaning the viewer needs to have some psi capacity. You need a transcript, a way of writing down what you see. And then the most important thing is feedback. You have to have feedback because otherwise you're just viewing into oblivion and making up a story, right? And that's okay, actually, that's useful, but that is not remote viewing. That's not a remote viewing experiment. And so the reason why I felt like it was appropriate to share this, even though it deviates slightly, is that there is direct feedback. We had a map and we had a local confirming the map. And so that serves as feedback in this limited situation. I'm sure I could find people who would argue with me, but yeah.
About E's training. So how much had she gone through, systematic experimental training with remote viewing? Because I'm just wondering, like, part of my skeptical side here is like, well, she could just be making it up, and it could be a coincidence that the road looks like this road. So I'm just wondering what is her background in terms of, like, because the training is intense, isn't it?
It's several years.
Yeah.
I know that she's worked for agency. She's worked for law enforcement. She's worked for district attorneys. She had, I guess I cut that from this talk, sorry. She has, been hired by corporations, has done lots of missing persons all over the world. She's well trained. Yes.
I don't know, is there any research pertaining to, like, if there's any similarities with working with psychedelics, like, could that amplify the remote viewing experience? Or I just want to know, like, are there any research that with them working hand in hand, or
I'm sorry, I missed the noun. Working with whom?
Psychedelics,
like psychedelic research, like, could it amplify the remote viewing experience or harm it in any way? I don't know the advice.
I do not know. I don't know of any research with psychedelics and remote viewers.
Yeah. Usually people who have psychedelic experiences talk about out-of-body experiences and just like seeing themselves in a different light and like, or perhaps coming to actually know who they are now, in a sense. So I wonder if that would work. Yeah.
That's something to think about. I've never thought of that. Do you want to answer, to add to that, Christine?
Just that there is some research that psychedelics do encourage extrasensory perception experiences, and there's a researcher in the UK called David Luke who's been doing some research on that. A lot of the research is on himself because of ethics, but he is finding some interesting results. You should take our class. We're just talking about that. Psychedelics and psychology.
So what is your class called?
Psychedelics and psychology.
Psychedelics and psychology.
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that offered next semester or?
No. We're just doing it now.
Yeah, you.
Can you say more about what kind of training that, I mean, you said so it's extensive, it was many years, and you talked a little bit about what the government was doing during the Cold War, and I'm just kind of curious how much of it's natural aptitude, how much of it's training, and then if different government law enforcement agencies are doing this, why I guess this is just like a local versus feds type thing, why police departments would be so hesitant. So can you
I think they're hesitant, it's abstract, number one, I think it's pretty abstract, but compared to, and you know, feel free to jump in, but compared to the traditional way that law enforcement is taught to proceed, I think that they could treat it like a tip. I think that at the very least, they could treat a remote viewing transcript like a tip, like of someone calling in and with an anonymous tip. It would be better if they gave it more value, but the training is extensive. It was not ever meant really to leave the government agency, from what I understand. And you had other parts of your
So
question.
it's like how much of it's aptitude versus training?
Oh, yeah. So the thing about remote viewing, and this is important, but almost difficult to explain. It is, a remote viewing is an experimental method, and it isn't actually a psi capacity. So you have to have psi capacity in order to, it's some measure of psi capacity in order to have a successful remote viewing session. It's a format, it's a method, it's a structure that was designed by Ingo Swann to funnel or to apply psi capacity to data collection. So it's a mechanical structure in some ways. It's actually not the psi. And so from what I've been reading, your psi capacity gets stronger through the training. You're building new neural pathways as you're training. You're learning how to tap into your psi, and you're learning how your psi communicates with you. So you're learning how, are you a clairvoyant? Are you more telepathically inclined? Do you get precognitive information? Some people get all of those things. Some people have one. What kind of senses? How do you receive information? Do you feel it tactilely? Do you taste it? Do you smell it? Do you get physically upset? You know, that's more of the training, like really learning how your psi capacity can be interpreted through the remote viewing structure. Is that helpful? It's they're very deliberate in all of the papers I've been reading, but it's easy to think that it is a psi capacity, but it is not. It's a method. Yes.
Have you been in contact or read anything about Major, I think it's Ed Dames? He was part of the project, he wrote books and he has done lecture circuits.
So I'm not, I know Ed Dames's name, but, there are many files in the Ingo Swann archives with Ed Dames's name on them, but I have not gotten to those yet. I know he's important. Does anyone else want to speak to? Okay. Yeah.
Another question from online, this says, does this mean that a life taken in a traumatic event cannot find release unless the family acknowledges it? And what if that life had no family?
I don't think that's what this means. I think in many ways a family's, and this is true in mediumship too, a family's holding on to the loss sort of creates an echo chamber between that person's existence and their absence. And so it ends up becoming almost like a circular energy. This is what's been explained to me. It's like if you're still hanging on, it's true of anything in life. If you're still hanging on to any kind of loss, I think when you look at literature with mediums working with poltergeists, you know, in the house with a family going through a divorce, there's this echoing, there's this external manifestation of phenomena, maybe based on the internal experience. So I think if the missing person has no family, there's less of that back and forth. There's less of that circular energy.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yes.
Thanks, Suzanne, for your talk. My question is kind of two parts. So the first part is I'm curious, what Ingo would say regarding the connection between remote viewing and imagination.
Mhm.
And then the second part, would be how do you kind of discern, right? How do you tell the difference, right, between what's imagination and what's remote viewing?
Tried to think if I found anything, but I know that because remote viewing is so specifically focused on data collection, you're trained to sort of receive versus create. It's a different mechanism, but I don't know that I have found any information in the files yet about that distinction. There was a second part to your question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, how do you tell the difference? You know, maybe just from maybe your own experience or what you've read, you know, how do you discern, you know, what's remote viewing versus kind of what's your own imagination?
I'm not a remote viewer, but I would say that they feel different. One is generative, and the other one is more of a download, I think. Any other remote viewers online want to speak to that?
I'm not, but I assume that's why the feedback portion is also important, because then you have confirmation of, oh, I know what that park is. Oh, we know that name, we recognize that name. So it isn't just someone just like coming up with a fictional story. It's like also you have someone confirming, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I think that's right.
I guess I'll interject that Ingo developed analytical overlays, AOLs, to help control for imagination. If you think that you are remote viewing something very specific that could be your imagination, that's when you write that off to the side as, I'm just going to write this data down because this could be it. This came in as a signal, but don't marry it. And I've written it down, it's in the data, now I'm going to let it go and step back. So to deal with imagination, you just kind of write it down real quick and then forget about it, unless it keeps coming up. And when it repeats itself over and over in different ways, that's when the signal puts a little more weight on that particular data. Yeah.
As factual or as remote viewed,
as
remotely viewed.
Yes, as a stronger, that you have a stronger connection to the target. So I'd say AOL or analytical overlay would be kind of what he created to try and control.
Yes.
With the feedback in the case that you looked at with Kath, Dawn, and EL, there was the initial transcript and 25-minute recording, right? So then was it an iterative process that then EL produced more, or it was just one and done and then confirmed like, oh yeah, that makes sense?
It was one and done. She was not asked to do more. She would have done more if she was asked, but they did not ask.
So I guess it's interesting to call that feedback, because it's not that the feedback is informing what she's doing, right?
It's informing what she's done. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just recommend that he wrote a book, Ed Dames did. Anybody that's interested, like he went into more detail about the protocols. It's been years since I read it, so I don't remember a whole lot, but you know, everything, but it's very fascinating and And as the gentleman at the top, at the front said, it was very strict, had to have an exact target. You had somebody else out there affirming it. And, you got that feedback immediately, but of course it didn't help that he's gone to Afghanistan or that there's nobody out there, but it was it's a fascinating thing, and I would recommend it better.
It's a very strict format usually. I will say that this was more of a freestyle approach, but I think that the purpose was different. But yes, that's correct. It's usually a very strict format. Mhm. Yes.
Related to imagination and, knowing what's the information learning when you're remotely. I wanted to ask, like, would there be some sort of question directed about like, towards like the target, saying like, oh, target, could you reveal some sort of information? Or like, is it just you're focusing on the target and whatever download comes in, and that's what you write? And then
Yeah.
the question asked.
The other, I'm going to rephrase what I thought you said. Is there communication with the target between the viewer and the target? Meaning asking the target for information? I don't know what happens in viewers' heads usually. I think that they have an intuitive connection with the target. They do not know what the target is usually. Usually it's blind. And so they're more communicating with their process, I think, than whatever is at the target. But I think that there is a dialogue that goes back and forth between viewer and target. It's not conscious, but I think that does happen.
No, we're questions, just sort of some commentary that's going down in the chat where they're agreeing that download versus generative is a good description of remote viewing versus reception versus imagination. Someone also said that remote viewing leads to the interesting question on the nature of imagination and the imaginal and our understanding, and that we might be enclosing different concepts with the same word when they feel and act very differently. And another person added that Ingo also used stage 5 to break apart AOL data, which I don't know what that means, but I'm assuming that other people further into the field do.
Stage 5 is, I guess, an advanced stage, and AOL is analytical overlay. So I haven't come across that yet. Just how those stages get broken down.
Here's the geeky library question. What's the most interesting or surprising thing you have found so far in the archives? Like, because you've been here plenty, so tell us about that.
Women. It's the most interesting.
Thank you.
And Cole.
Lynn and Cole for sure. I found the whole archive is incredible. It's so distracting. It takes great restraint to not follow every single fascinating lead. I found the moon boxes, a lot of information about the moon. I came here with a question. I came here with a lot of questions, but one of my questions was about what did Ingo recommend in terms of how we should deal with the ET UFO issue. So I was looking in a lot of those files. I could speak to that briefly. It's clear that he was very interested and very involved in remote viewing celestial objects, the moon, Jupiter, Mars. He had a lot of interest in the fact that every abductee talks about communicating with ETs telepathically, and how somehow that fact does not get discussed openly. that one characteristic that abductees have in common is that when there was communication happening, they somehow knew they were communicating telepathically. It wasn't difficult. They didn't have to try. That's just how the communication happened. And so the answer to my question was, I found in an essay that he published, I think it was in Fate magazine, that he really believed that the way to deal with the ET UFO issue was through psi, was that pathway was important in terms of our future relationships with UFOs, the topic of UFOs and ETs. So that was pretty interesting.
That might be a great place to actually conclude our evening. Thank you so much for being here. I would encourage each of you to come down and use Ingram Library's special collections. We have such remarkable materials, many of which explain the remote viewing process through a multitude of methodologies. And they're materials that really explore consciousness from different fields, if it be art or physics or psychology, or geology. And it's just a great place for people who are questioners and adventurers and who are curious.
How do we access that?
Special collections, you just email us special@westgaw.edu and we will set up a research appointment with you. A lot of our researchers live remotely, and so we facilitate, my GRAs, we facilitate that research and provide scans when the materials are conducive to being scanned. But we also have people who come to stay for weeks at a time to delve into archival research. So thank you all so much for being here, and I encourage you to have a brief visit with Suzanne. She's had a very long day today, but please come introduce yourself and welcome Suzanne into our basically permanent UWG community now.
Thank you.